Thank you. So I'll just get on stage here. Hi. Thank you for coming along. So I'm just going to sit and play some things and have a good old ramble for a while, and then we can chat at the end. So, yeah, I'm sort of teetering on the brink here on my seat, so I might fall off the back of the stage at some point, but hopefully not. We'll see how we go. My name is Max Cooper. I make music. I make visual collaborations. I do lots of scientifically inspired, socially inspired projects. The one on screen at the moment is from the Herodes Atticus Theatre in Athens on the hill of the Acropolis. And the visualization up there is symmetry. So this is one of the early visual projects I did with Kevin McLaughlin. And it was sort of early starting points when I was transitioning from working in the sciences to working in doing audiovisual shows as my main sort of thing I did. And I started off with a realization that a lot of my interest in the sciences had these really beautiful visual components, which I could build shows from, ultimately. And I started off, the first audiovisual album I did was called Emergence, and then I was looking at what's the foundational structures of nature which give rise to the world around us, and symmetry is one of the most important. This idea you can drop an apple, and then tomorrow you can drop the same apple. It'll do the same thing. You can face north or south, or you can face a different direction and drop the apple. You can step over there and drop the apple. There's all these symmetries which mean that there's change without change. You can change your position or direction or your time, but the same laws apply, and these give rise to essentially symmetries are somewhat equivalent to laws. It's saying there are things in nature which are set, and that was an early project I did, which I love projecting. A lot of the projects I do, I love projecting onto architecture. And when we do the show here, we'll use the sort of architecture of the space and I love working with projectors as opposed to LED screens, so that we can have that interaction of the form of the visuals with the form of the space. So I'm just going to go on to another sort of sciencey one before we delve into some more humanized things later. This one was another. I was interested in aesthetics relating to the infinite and our sort of endless search for meaning. And I wanted to do a project with the digits of pi. So pi, the first digit of pi is 3. So we start off and divide the screen into 3. And then the second digit is 3.1. So the far left rectangle divides, there's one division line. And then 3.14, so there's that 3.1. And then you get 3.14, and then you get 3.141, and so on and so forth. And what happens is it'll endlessly divide the screen into following these digits. And something that I've come across a lot of times, and something that's been really interesting for me working, from an aesthetic, artistic perspective, is learning about nature and delving into the aesthetics of nature. And nature can be a leaf or a beautiful, traditional natural landscape, for example, but it can also be the digits of pi are, in my mind, as natural as a leaf. It's such a foundational constant. It's the difference. How many draw a circle, draw a line across it. How many times can that line fit into that circle? And it turns out that you can keep dividing this space. You have to keep dividing this space forever. You never get to a number that you can write as a fraction. That is the number of times that distance across the circle will go into the loop around it. It's an infinite. It's called transcendental numbers. You have to infinitely calculate the digits, and it never stops. And also, it doesn't only never stop, but it's Borel normal, which means that the probability of the next digit is equally likely to be any of the values, between 0 and 9. So there's actually it's an infinite string of randomness in a sense. It's not random because it's the digits of pi, but it doesn't have a structure. So there's this really interesting thing that I've found many times in different projects, where nature has this real tendency to create disorder from order and order from disorder. They're two sides of the same coin in a sense. And the aesthetics of that can be really beautiful. So that's something that I'll probably return to later on as we delve into other projects. So yeah, I'm going to go to something totally different now, which is something more on the human side. So as time went on and I started doing more of these projects, I naturally tended towards what was interesting to me. And I suppose this has been listed as a masterclass, so I guess I'll try and orient what I'm saying a little bit in terms of tips and how I approach these projects. But generally my angle has been what am I interested in, what's exciting, and I read as much as I can, and I put as much into my head as I can, and just make lots of notes of things that I find exciting, or screenshots of beautiful things. And then some project comes along where it's, in this case it was a commission from the Barbican in London to make a show, and I had this theme of aesthetics of the infinite, and then it spawned all these different chapters, and then I write all the chapters up, and I start sending those chapters to visual artists, or in this case a mathematician, Martin Kwaswinski, who made this. And just follow where the interest and the excitement goes, and just see where that leads me. Another project I did recently called On Being was asking members of the public, what do you want to express that you feel you can't in everyday life? And actually, before I do that, I just want to say one more thing about this transcendental tree map. So music, obviously, I'm a musician. How do I make the music for this? How do I turn this process into a piece of music? The way I did it was I was interested in this nested structure. So the fact, this thing keeps subdividing. How can I make a subdividing piece of music? So I found a guy, was recommended someone called Alexander Randon, who's based in San Francisco, and he makes music composition tools. And I spoke to him about this challenge. I said, I want to make a system where I can have a melodic structure, so a melodic contour, maybe the note here, up one semitone, down two, for example. And I want to be able to apply that contour to itself over different time scales, like a fractal, so that you get the same pattern, but it'll apply to itself over half a second, over 1 second, over 2, over 4, over 8. And each different time scale will modulate the other ones. So what you get is this, starting off very simple, like the same as the visual, but then modulating into these different, more and more complex melodic forms. And it's very, heavily electronic sort of piece and fitting with the idea. So I'm not going to play the whole piece, but I'm just going to skip through it a little bit so you can hear what I'm talking about. And these are all these projects are on my YouTube page, so you can delve in, and all the links there and the explanations. And each album has its own website as well, explaining things in much more detail. But as you can hear, as you apply more of these fractal line modulations, the melody starts getting more and more complex. And then sort of is glued together with a harmonic progression. So anyway, I'm not going to stay on that one because there's a lot to talk about. So let's go to something totally different. I asked the question, what do you want to express that you feel you can't in everyday life? And we made a website with Savary Computery and Min Jong An, a Korean artist and Polish artist. And I was really shocked by how beautiful and honest the responses the people were submitting. I just went to the website this morning, actually, before coming here, and screen recorded this. So all of these things you're saying, I hadn't read these until today. This is just what came today when I went on that On Being website, onbeing.maxcooper.net is the site, and you can just click it, and every time you click, a new submission comes up, and they're all nearly all anonymous. Some of them aren't, and some of the I went through thousands of these and then chose which ones I could turn into pieces of music. And then some of the May Casper, for example, became a collaborator on the lyrics of one of them, who's someone who'd submitted a poem to this project. But there's just this really beautiful, human, powerful collection of work, which then became an album and an installation project as well. And it's still running. So the install is where people can put in real time, write their thoughts, and then it projects all around them, similar to, we've got an extra projector in the space today to show a little bit of the wraparound feel I often bring into the shows. But yeah, it just hit me really hard, and then it was something I didn't know it was going to be an album, but when I started reading these things, it just took over my thoughts and my life, and I had to delve in and do justice to what people had been submitting. And a lot of the time, my projects work like that. I'll read things and chat to people about things I'm interested in, and just something or other will just grab me, and I'll have to do that. It often feels like making music and making art projects isn't something you don't choose to do it. It chooses you, or you can't not do it. So you just you do it. And also, there's also a very therapeutic aspect to it for me, in terms of particularly the ideas I've mentioned with the digits of pi, or the ideas of symmetry, or looking at these sorts of really honest comments is very grounding. And if I'm having a hard time, then it really helps to share these things with other people and see that they're sharing things with me and others. And then also the natural side of it, just the delving into these really deep sort of natural structures, is very, can't think of the right word for it, but it's almost like there are structures that transcend us, and they're always going to be there, and it doesn't matter what happens with our lives, and and they're beautiful. So that's part of the reason I do this work. So let's jump into something totally different again. I'm working on a new project called Feeling is Structure, and it was based on this, which I'll be presenting here in a few weeks. It started at the Albert Hall. I went into the space, and it's this epic space, and I started thinking about how to fill it with light and sound. A lot of the projects I do have a three-dimensional aspect. We use semi-transparent layers and haze with projectors and lasers into haze to build sort of three-dimensional images in the space. And I started thinking a lot about, because I was working with a physical space, how to map feelings to a physical space. And then this whole Feeling is Structure project emerged with lots of architectural projects, but also biological projects. There was an MRI scan of my brain that we then used for a visual piece and for music. And I was interested not only in how we can take our feelings and imbue them onto, whether it's the structure of music or, faces, like body language, like architecture, all these different things. But we also, any state of mind and any feeling also has a sort of neural correlates of consciousness type of counterpart of physical. All the neurons that are firing in a particular pattern represent that feeling and that state of mind. So that led me onto some projects from a more biological perspective, and this one's called The Shape of Memory with Factory 15. I was interested in the sort of the aesthetics and the feeling and the structure of memory, and how it has this surreal, imprecise, incomplete aesthetic quality. And they did this process where we asked public for photographs which are important to them, memories which are important to them. They can submit as photographs. And then Factory 15 did this Gaussian splat technique to turn these two-dimensional photographs into these extrapolated but also degraded and partially incomplete representations of memories. So it's real memories that then get fused together into this big flow through all these different people's history, ultimately. So it was a really nice project that also lends itself very well to that three-dimensional. I do a lot of these 3D AV shows where it's, we have semi-transparent layers. I think you could see it on that first picture as well, when you've got that sort of layer outside of the screen, outside of that big monument in the back. And we use multiple screens like this to be able to bring things out towards you in the audience. Another one from the Feeling is Structure project was something very different, where I was getting really excited about new sort of bass sounds, like really gnarly and naughty bass sounds, and getting excited about all these old drum and bass sounds and sort of things that genres that I've loved. A lot of my work fuses together lots of different genres, and I've come from the electronic music scene and the sort of rave scene since the 90s, and I like to bring all those influences together, but not stick to any genre. Very much the show flows across many genres, but I very much draw on that background as well as my scientific background, and then my sort of human sort of just social commentary and what life's like now. All these things fuse together, and I guess that's another tip, if you call it that, in terms of this masterclass idea that we're doing some sort of class. But for me, the process of making art projects that are impactful has been very much about how can I take what's specific to my life and what's happened to me and what I'm interested in, how can I put as much of that as possible into the project? How do I squeeze more of myself? The more of myself I can get into there, then the more powerful or the more well-received or the more interesting the projects become. So it's just about, and we all have our own life paths and our own unique experiences and backgrounds. And for me, it's very much about how we can share those with each other, and that's the process of making art from my perspective. So anyway, this one was my love of bass sounds, and I just did this. I think there's 220 or 225 layers in this, and then each one's 6 minutes or so. There's like 22 hours. I spent 22 hours just recording all these sounds, all these gnarly sounds and sort of things I was excited about. I spent, just hours and hours and hours recording them all. And then I was like, okay, now I have to structure all these into a piece of music. So it became this really obsessive structuring process, and that was the structure I decided to roll with. That was the idea. I wanted to turn the musical creation and the Ableton project itself into the audiovisual project. So I then chatted to Savory Computery, the Polish artist, who is similarly, I've worked with him on many projects, and he has a real obsessive attention to detail. Like before the presentation I did 2 days ago in Birmingham, he was sending me updates like just before, like, can you put this in? And, he's always like last minute, constantly wanting to tweak everything, and he gets really engaged and obsessive about it. So I wanted to bring that through in the project because that's what the project was about. So he took this Ableton session and built this HTML reactive code which syncs all of this information to a visual system, which I'll just play a little bit of. So you can see, it shows the waveforms, but it also shows the arrangement and just takes all the structural ideas, but then also adds in loads of little, because we wanted it to be socially meaningful as well. It's not just about this piece of music, but it's about the obsessions that we all have to deal with in terms of the barrage of emails and information that we have, and timekeeping, and now more so than ever, we have to deal with a lot. So he has all these. We put loads of our friends' names in there, and basically had all these email and notes to self, and follow up with this person, and don't forget to do this thing and that thing, and like, do I need to go to sleep or review, check in, like, there's a lot of, I need to make dinner, okay, or cancel. There's a lot of, we wanted to have some fun with it as well. So then you can see the whole arrangement. So it was just a fun way of taking the ideas and turning it into an audiovisual project. So I'm going to just go on to another one. Let's see, where should we go? Something totally different. Okay, so a lot of the time the way I work is a commission comes in. In this case, there was a Salzburg festival in Austria, and they said, we want you to build, they're an opera and classical music festival, and they had an Italian theme for the year, and they said, we want you to build an electronic classical opera crossover to do with Italy, which was quite a total. I never would have planned to do that myself, but okay, it's a beautiful space there, and why not? Let's try to see where this goes. So I started going through Italian classical music and historic music, and I found this beautiful sort of choral Catholic church music by Palestrina, sort of religious chanting, harmonizing music. That it was just really beautiful, and a lot of the harmonic ideas related to the ones that I'm interested in as well. So I thought, okay, so that was a starting point. And then I worked with Sarah Aristidou and Kim Sheehan, opera singers, and Neil Zorenz playing synths as well, to restructure this into, you know, my world in terms of it's slightly harmonically restructured. And then I started chatting to a friend, Quaola, who's an Italian artist, about this commission, and he was like, well, I'm actually doing this project as well in Carrara. So this is the mountain in Carrara, where they've been extracting all of this, you know, beautiful white marble. So this is the piece of marble being extracted for Quaola's project. And it was just it was an example of just following what presents itself. I could have never have afforded to or made happen this project. You know, I couldn't have commissioned this myself, but a lot of projects happen like that, where it's just the path of least resistance and what's exciting, and trying to do what's the best thing and the most emotionally engaging thing I can do now. And at the start, that was just sitting at my computer and writing music. And I just did that for years and years and years and years. Spent all my time, you know, 15 hours a day for however 20 years or whatever it was, just making music and making mixes and dedicating myself to it. But now I'm finding there's a lot of sort of beautiful projects available that are coming from the visual realm, and that's why I've just delved into that and more, and doing a lot more installations and things outside of just writing music. But writing music is still the core of my work. So in this case, Quaola was doing this process, and he said, why don't you make a score, and we'll link this process of building this sculpture, again, you know, from this famous Italian marble. We'll link it all together, and the process of making the project becomes the project. Similarly to the one with Savaray, where we turned the sort of making of the Ableton session into the project itself. So he 3D captured these fighters. It's called his sculpture is called Fighters, and he 3D captured them and then extracted this piece of marble and turns it into this beautiful 3D sculpture. Like, if it's beautiful sculpture, I'm just gonna skip ahead a bit so we can see it. That's here we go. And also the robots, you know, there's this really beautiful process of the robots working with the marble. And then eventually you get this epic sculpture. So it's a totally different sort of project, but one that was interesting. So let's see what else we've got. This one, I mentioned these quotes, and we showed some quotes earlier. One of the quotes was, I have a sense of getting closer to something which I know my life depends on, but I do not know if I should be excited or terrified about what will happen. And it struck me, it just had a lot of emotional energy and a lot of apprehension and anticipation, and it provided a lot of material. You know, the emotion was there that I could work with, and it had a clear structural idea that I could map to musical form, because I love these sort of tension building use of harmonies and synthesis. So I just delved in with that quote. And I worked with Connor Griffith, who's an artist from LA. And we were interested in how can we map this sort of process of moving towards something to a visual system. And the thing we both agreed on was this idea of the barrage of advertising and propaganda, and just that we live in a world that's very much trying to direct us into particular thought processes for the gain of those in control of those systems, often for money, but for political reasons, and we all know too well. So we thought, how can we represent that visually? And Connor, went to his parents' garage and found this massive stash of ancient, magazines and newspapers and things, and started scanning them all. But then he also found a lot of, more modern advertising pieces on, for different films and food items and everything. It's American, so it has a particular flavor, but there's a lot of things you'll recognize in there as well. And then he turned these into this beautiful installation, sort of sculptural piece. So it was a way of making an abstract art piece, but that has a social message in there, and that's often the thing I'm trying to aim for with these. And it was a beautiful project, so I wanted to include it. So eventually it goes from these types of things into social media feeds as well. So you've got these newspapers, and then these scratch cards. I remember that you recognize all these like multicolored scratch cards that you'll probably recognize. And then eventually, this sort of time-stretched social media feed barrage. So yeah, that was a fun one. Sticking with the theme of sort of fortuitous meetings and just doing what presents itself. I was doing a show in Seoul maybe 4 years ago, and this artist, Casey Yorp, had got in touch and said he wanted to meet and show me his work. So I met him at the show, and he had this folder full of these paintings that he'd been making. He'd been listening to my music and making these paintings, and there was a sequence of them as well. They sort of joined together in like a stop frame sequence, and I was really struck by how powerful and beautiful they were. He's really interested in this trans or post-humanism idea and sort of changing ourselves into sort of star-going species, for example. So he's got these wild ideas of in what he's presenting in his art, and he showed me all this, and I loved it, but I didn't know. I was like, I don't know what to do with this, but so can you give me some time? And he was very patient, and I held it until the New Feeling is Structure project came along, and something suddenly presented itself where it all clicked and fit together. And often it's like that. Interesting ideas come along, and I'll try and make a note of them and remember them, and so I've just got thousands and thousands of random notes about different things and screenshots, and then just whenever a new commission or a new project comes, I start to draw, maybe glance over that thing, those sort of things. But a lot of the time it just comes because it's in there somewhere, and it's just about letting it present itself at the right time and not forcing projects whenever there isn't a clear direction. Like with this one, it took years for it to sort of come together. But the reason it came together was I mentioned I play lots of different genres, and there's part of the show where it's sort of like drum and bass tempo, and then it needs to go to like slow, housey sort of techno tempo, and I needed a bridging piece, and a friend, Sorcery, who's a really brilliant producer called Merlin, and he's in Berlin, and he had this track that had this really amazing structure that allowed me to do mix into both and speed up or slow down between these two different genres of very different BPMs. So I started chatting to him. I was like, can we collaborate on something with this type of structure you've invented? But our worlds are very different. He's really industrial, sort of techno type, really, really beautifully brutal music, as opposed to mine, which is a lot more melodic. So it turned into this bridging. The whole thing, the piece is called This Is a Bridge, and it's a bridge between genres. It's a bridge between Merlin's world and my world musically. And then the thing I was interested in with Casey Yorp in Seoul was I said, okay, can we take your paintings and then get dancers and work with a choreographer and have the dancers hold the pieces of hold the paintings in sequence so that we can bridge between, the worlds of dance and the worlds of, your visual, sort of your painting, your fine art world, and the world of dance and choreography. Can we make a bridge between those worlds as well? So the whole project became this sort of bridging structure in many different ways. And it's a super intense part of the show. It'll probably be in the show, for here as well. But it has Merlin's industrial feel, and it has Casey Yorp's post-humanism feel, and then this bridging of genres and this really intense. So that's just a little taste of it, but it gets really crazy. But it was just I was just really happy with how it came out, so I wanted to mention it and explain where it all came from, really. But there's not a lot of time to spend. If we spend too much time looking at each thing, then we won't get through much, and I'm just going to ramble on through. So something totally different. Now I'm really into spatial audio. So here we've got some photographs of some different, spatial audio, meaning rather than just having the sound coming from two stereo speakers, you can have speakers all around the room, and the sound can move around you, which sounds like a bit of a gimmick, but the reality is that, when we walk into a room, without knowing it, we're taking there's loads of cues that are coming into our ears about what the sort of surfaces are and how big the room is and what the sort of objects are, without us even knowing about it. But when you start to play with those signals, you really notice that it has an emotional impact. I mean, and you could say, if there's a growling rustle in the leaves behind you, your ancient evolutionary brain is, panicking, thinking that you're going to get eaten by a tiger or something. So these are hardwired in. So we've got these responses. Or if the sound of some huge freight train flying towards you at high speed, your brain's going to pay attention to that. And these are the sorts of signals you can start to play with. You can put them into your composition process when you have a spatial audio system. So you can start to story tell in ways that you can't do with a basic stereo system. That's why it's exciting. The bottom right image are binaural microphones. So they're little microphones I always travel with, and the microphones go inside my ears. So it looks like I'm wearing headphones. So what you can do is you can walk around in any environment. People think you're just listening to music, but what you're actually doing is recording all the sounds in that environment in their very natural form. And if a sound comes from the right-hand side and gets to your right ear, it gets recorded into your right ear first, and then it takes some milliseconds or whatever to get to the left ear, and then it gets recorded into the left ear. If it's coming from behind you, it will, get filtered by the shape of your ear and your bones, and that gets recorded in. All these really subtle signals, which you would never be able to hear, but are, subconsciously your brain interprets those. So whenever you listen with headphones, you can tell that something's coming from the right side or from behind, or, you get this full three-dimensional spatial image when you're listening with headphones. So that's binaural recording, which I do a lot of that recording, and I then chop up these little sounds, like little clicks or me scraping something, and I use those as individual percussive sounds or as little detailings, and I put loads of those into my music as a way of building this feeling of existing inside some sort of surreal structure. Or sometimes I'll want a really, I don't want it to be surreal. There's a piece, Gravesend, from the last album where I'm walking on these leaves in the forest, and they're crunching under feet, and I didn't chop it up. I just use it as it is to create that atmosphere. So I love, it's just an important technique, and the use of space and spatial audio is something that's really central to a lot of my work. So I'll play one piece which is very based on that technique, which was the sound of rain. Really heavy raindrops hitting the sort of Velux window, so it's angled window with the sort of rain coming down, big raindrops hitting the window. You can hear each individual raindrop. And I was working on a project called Emergence about how simple systems can give rise to really beautiful and unexpected outcomes, and how you can describe everything. You can describe all the biology in the world and all the genetics in the world, and all the neuroscience in the world, but it doesn't really give you any intuitively satisfying reason why it feels like it feels to be you now, sitting, listening to this and being aware of it doesn't seem to be that connected to all of this science that explains what you are. You could say, well, consciousness is emergent, which is emergentism is a decent explanation, it's sometimes maybe unsatisfactory because it still doesn't explain exactly how it works. Just things happen that don't seem to be, there seem to be more than the sum of the parts. That's the idea. So it sort of connects science into this somewhat metaphysical realm, which is exciting, and that's often the things I turn to. And I was working with this idea, and how can I make an emergent piece of music? So I had these recordings of these raindrops hitting the window. And I marked every raindrop, not by, you can sort of get a system to sort of tag them. And then I had a drum pattern, and I tagged the drum sounds as well. So you've got these two grids, one's the rain and one's the drum pattern. And then what I needed to do was really slowly and gradually push the raindrops towards the drum pattern. So what you get is this emergent rhythm. So the randomness of rain becomes somewhat structured, but it still sounds like rain, but it noticeably becomes something more musical. And then I started playing this little kalimba, it's called a sansula, a little thumb-plucked instrument along with that, and building on that, and the whole piece of music, emerged from this process. So it was another way of how can I connect my music to these ideas from the sciences or whatever it is, these human ideas. How can I meaningfully connect my music to the visuals and the ideas? And that's very much my process. I don't often use data mapping, where I occasionally I do, but the problem is when you take data and you sort of, map. There's one I did mapping the Fibonacci sequence to a drum pattern, and it's really unmusical. And I had to work with an amazing drummer to make it work. The things that aren't music don't usually map to music and sound good. So I often look for a way of mapping the idea as opposed to a literal mapping. So I'll play this so you can hear the process of this emergent piece of music while I have a drink of water. 1 second. So yeah, the visuals by Maxime Courceret, who's based in Lyon, who's an amazing artist, who then took these ideas of emergence into the visual realm, sort of the emergence of life and flocking patterns and reaction diffusion systems, and he really had this beautiful interface between an artistic interpretation and these science-related systems. So that was a really fun project. So something totally different again. Something from the new Feeling is Structure project. This is with Katia Schultz and Jack Fisher. It's called Pattern Index, and I had this idea of I wanted to work with pattern generators. A lot of the new album because I was playing with structural ideas, so I was looking for ways of techniques for structuring pieces of music, and how I could link those structuring techniques to particular, the way they feel, and this idea of how we can imbue these abstract structures with our humanity in a sense. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to I want to just throw in as many pattern generators as I can. So pattern generators like simple, different types of looping systems and arpeggiators and sort of repetitively glitching systems. And I just started throwing them all in there, and it really wasn't working. And I thought the whole thing was just going to fail, and I just kept on going for some weeks. Just kept on going, and then eventually, some critical mass happened where it all just came together and it worked. And I'd considered just binning the whole project at some point along the way. And this is a conundrum that I face all the time, and I think making art projects that is quite a central conundrum, which is what to keep and what to throw away, and how to know when to make those decisions, because you're really in this sort of Turing halting problem sort of situation where you don't know if there's no way of knowing if something's going to work or not by the end. The only way you can know is just by doing it. But you can end up, sometimes I'll spend a month or 2 months working on something and have to bin it. And and that's really painful. But I also think that's a really important part of the process. Binning things is the people I know whose work I respect the most, whose work I love. There seems to be a correlation between how many times they fail and how good they are at their craft, and accepting, introducing failure or embracing failure as part of the process has been very important for me. And I guess that's the way of keeping myself sane. If I work on something for a month and have to bin it, the only way I can stay sane is by saying that's a good thing it's part of the process. And if you allow that, you ultimately it enhances or it encourages creativity. But in this case, luckily it didn't. It actually worked after some amount of time when I thought it wasn't going to work. And then I was interested in how we could take this idea of a barrage of pattern and apply it to the built environment. So I wanted to look at the shapes and structures that are the atoms of the built environment. So Jack Fisher had all this epic cityscape footage, and then Katia looked for recurring patterns in the built environment and then layered them all together into this beautiful sort of barrage, which very much aligns with the musical barrage of all these patterns. So it all came together nicely. That's going back to something very natural. This is a DNA, mouse chromosomes in a computer, all laid out in a big spiral. This is with Mikhail Spivakov at the Babraham Institute in Cambridge, who got in touch and said, I'm doing this research. I'm interested in turning my research into an art project. So I worked with Andy Lomas, and Andy built this system to take their research data on mouse chromosomes and present it in this, beautiful format. So their experiments detected of all this DNA where the points of contact were. So what were the sequences internally of the chromosomes that were touching, and then there's a simulation which you can see unfolding now is trying to predict how to tangle up all these chromosomes in the right way so that all the correct bits of all the different bits of the chromosomes are touching, and then that reveals this predicted end state of how the DNA is all jumbled up, because this, we all know about genes, which are these sequences of DNA that code for proteins. But if the DNA is tangled up in such a way that that gene is wrapped tightly amongst other bits of DNA that it can't be accessed by the proteins that need to bind on there to actually express the gene, it won't get expressed. So the structure of DNA is really important, and it's important in disease and important in understanding how life works. So it was the red parts are then the areas of gene expression, so the areas that can be accessed, and then the genes from there start to be expressed. So it was just a really nice way of connecting to some biological science and some real science, and being able to show, as part of ultimately what people would see as an abstract visual, but really you're showing something that's really meaningful and real biology. And I love those sorts of projects. I love the idea that you can take scientific projects, and when you can present them authentically, you can present real opportunity for insight. So I love the idea that someone could, for example, if we put on one with the Riemann-Zeta function, which is this famous problem about the distribution of the primes by Dugan Hammack, who visualized it. You can put some really legitimate scientific ideas up there that are unsolved problems, and someone can potentially get real insight into these problems from an art project. I love that. I love that idea. Maybe it's not very realistic, but I like to. If there's anything unsolved that I can show, I'll always be very drawn to that, because it has this extra sort of spice and level of curiosity about it. So let's see, what shall I play next? I'm going to play. Okay, let's look at this one. So this is St. Michael's Kirk in Leuven, where I was asked to make an installation for this beautiful church. So obviously, you know, a church has a really particular feeling, and you can see all these people lying on these things like some bizarre sight. It was during COVID; they've got their masks on. And I did the project with Salvador Breed and Martin Kwaswinski, and I was interested in connecting together some spiritual ideas of, it's called transcendence, with scientific ideas of transcendence. What we did was we presented a system to start with 1 dimension, and then 2 dimensions of space, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5. It builds spatial dimensions. You know, in the sciences, we exist, you know, we're very familiar with a 3-dimensional space, but we're also very familiar with the 2-dimensional space of platform games or cartoons. You know, it's very natural for us to view things like that. And you can go from 2 to 3 just the same way as you can go from 3 to 4 or 4 to 5, even though they become hard for us to intuitively grasp. But it was a way of having this sort of step transcendence. And then we also work with sort of mapping the digits of pi, this transcendental number, so-called transcendental number, to these higher dimensional structures. So it was a way of tying some science together with some more spiritual ideas and then presenting it in this church. And then everyone would lie on these. We built these special tactile surfaces which would transmit the low frequencies as felt. You know, you'd actually feel the bass frequencies as this full body bass massage to give this feeling of weightlessness and trying to push people upwards. And then the piece of music is it just goes up and up and up, and it transcends itself. So the whole thing is very themed. I can play a little bit of it, but it was just another fun way of trying to tie these different interests together, and it ended up one of my, you know, from that project, Unspoken Words, it ended up one of my favorite pieces from there. It just carried a lot of feeling and energy. So that's going from 1 to 2 to 3 now, and then I'm not going to play the whole thing because it's quite long, but it does, obviously it gets very chaotic as it sort of builds, and then the digits of pi come in, and then it just turns into this crazy noise later on. Yeah, that was fun. So let's see, I think we're near the end. I don't want to, maybe I'll show you a couple more before we finish. Let's go with one of the new ones, Ebb and Flow. This is with Yoshi Sodioka, a New York artist. The idea with this one, is it coming up on there? Oh no, it's not coming up on there for some reason. Let's see. There we go. I was working with this, you know, this feeling of structure ideas, and I was interested in how structures can relate to the way we feel and how we imbue structures with our feelings and our humanity. And I was working with this ebb and flow idea of having melodies that one melody line goes up as the other one goes down, and they sort of intersect, and you get this emergent harmonic structure from these rising and falling melodies. And I was also interested in the ebb and flow between the everyday world, the way we view the everyday world, and the sort of Platonic description, you could say, this scientifically oriented way of mapping, you know, reality to obscure, or sort of reality to objective systems, not obscure, but. And Yoshi, I immediately thought of Yoshi, who does these beautiful sort of dualistic animations showing real scenes mapped to some objective, like scientific-like description of them. And then he brought in this night and day, and then yin and yang, and all these different, you know, there's all these different sort of ebb and flow related ideas that he then fused into this animation. And then he has lots of layers of this, which map beautifully to the, you know, for the show, it'll be part of the show here. And it maps really beautifully to these multiple layers. And we have projections going into the middle of the room, which map the structures into haze as well. So we're firing smoke and then actually being able to project into the smoke to make three-dimensional hovering versions of these scenes as well. So that was a nice one too. But yeah, I think I'm gonna let you guys ask some questions now, because I think there's nothing else that, well, there's millions of things I could talk about, but I don't want to barrage you with too many things. I know I've already said a lot. So let's just say one more, Masanobu Hiraoka. So the On Being project, I wanted a way of, we had all of these beautiful quotes that I showed at the start, and I wanted a way of summarizing, they had such emotional power and beauty. And I'd been working on a piece of music with Felix Yerbalo, who's a great viola player. And I was wondering how to, I felt like we'd managed to capture a lot of the feeling of this entire project musically, but I wasn't sure how to do it visually. And then I met Masanobu in Tokyo and chatted about these ideas. And this is all hand-drawn, frame by frame. He's got this, he took all of these quotes and wrote this ubiquitous human life story in a sense. It's, you'll see all the cues as it goes through, but it was just, he's such a humanized and emotive way of storytelling with his drawings. It's a nice one to finish on. So yeah, that's from Masanobu Hiraoka, called On Being. And all of these projects I've been talking about are pretty much on the YouTube channel if you want to see any of them or read about the descriptions and link to the wider. They're all part of these album projects which have an overall theme, which I then write all these chapters for and start to then chat to visual artists about how to turn them into these pieces. So many thanks for listening. And is there another microphone that we can pass around, or should we just, yeah, there is, excellent. So that's not an updated list, but that's a sort of list of some of the artists involved. So there's many people involved in these projects, and many years of, decades of collaborations and commissions, really. So, is there a mic going around? Anyone want to put up a hand for questions? There's one guy at the front here with, yeah, thank you very much.
Well, first of all, I think it's fair to say you've given us all a great deal to assimilate, so thank you for that, Max. I'm almost paralyzed so you'll have to bear with me. I appreciate it's likely that your academic background is somewhat inextricably linked to your approach to music. But if it's possible, I'd like to delve into how you conceptualize music for music's sake. So if we can make a division somewhat between the collaborative work and the visual work that you are intrinsically involved in. You describe yourself as a musician. Do you ever make music simply for music's sake? And if so, are you able to share something about a workflow or a process that you go through in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I 100% make music for music's sake. Making music is the core of what I do and what I spend. If it was my way, I would spend all my time doing. It's the most, you know, anyone that, if you make music, it sounds like you maybe make music yourself, so you'll know that the beauty and the sort of, when you're just in that process of creating and you're lost in it and you lose touch with time and it's just this really amazing thing that I feel like everyone should try. So for me, that's what I would do with my time, irrespective of whether it was my job, you know. But in terms of my ethos or my techniques for music, I definitely have taken on board like natural aesthetics. There's a project, this is one thing I was potentially going to talk about during this presentation, which I didn't, which is this project with Dith Design, where he was 3D mapping forest floor structures. And I love, you know, going to the forest is my sort of second favorite thing after making music probably. And just, you can take any little segment of the forest floor and it's full of different species and sub-complexity and subsystems within systems. You know, it's this really rich nature, but, you know, is innately beautifully structured in a really hard to, you can't just pin it down and say it's fractal or it's this or that. It's so much more than that. But what it is it's nested structure within structure. There's always, the closer you look, the more you find, and you can keep going down and down, you know, almost indefinitely. And it's the same when you go up as well, you know, into bigger scales. So my approach to music is quite influenced by that type of structure. And also another one I would mention would be on my, you know, my wall. I've got this like Pollock's, you know, Jackson Pollock's like blue poles print, which I've been staring at for years. And again, it has a lot of this same sort of, when you see those works, if you ever see a Pollock in real life, they're really huge. And you get these prints of them which are small and they look super detailed. But when you go to look at the huge scale, the real life versions, if you stand right up to it, there's just as much structure and detail inside that sort of, your eyes right up to it. It's crazy that it has, which for me is this very natural aesthetic in relation to the forest floor, for example. And that's something that I've been on a mission musically to try and achieve that, and I haven't achieved it. But that's been one of the big inspirations for me as a general aesthetic musical approach, is like, how can I make something that the closer you listen, the more you find. And that's why I love spatial audio, because with spatial audio, you can start putting loads more structure in different places. Because with stereo, like, you know, with that obsessive compulsive order track, when you get to 200 layers or whatever, it starts to become really hard to hear more layers. You can add them, but it's really hard to hear them. But with spatial audio, you can actually hear, you can spread them out in space, so you can hear more of them. So I definitely have a strong, it's something I just haven't achieved it yet, but it's something a life sort of obsession I've had for a long time. But the other thing musically is just chord progressions. I just love, I'm a sucker for a lovely, you know, for what I would define as a beautiful chord progression. It's just something I've always, since I've been a kid, I've always been really drawn to. I was really drawn to electronic music because of the purest nature of those, of the chord progressions in there. And the simplicity, you know, like my music has that complexity, but actually it's very simple from a music theory perspective, you know, you're not including the timbral or spatial sort of size of things when you're looking at a purely harmonic and melodic structural position, you know, on my music. It's actually very simple, and it's very, you know, I love those, the chord progressions are the starting point for me making music. Usually I sit down and I'll often have some, theme that I'm working with, some science-related thing or some human theme. But really I'm looking for, how does that feel? Like I'll have some sort of particular structure relating to the theme that I have to work within. But then it's always like, how does it feel? And how do I feel now? And does this project even connect with how I'm feeling now enough for me to work on it? Because ultimately, if I'm in a particular mood, all I can express musically is that mood. I can only ever do, express the way I am at that point in time. And if I try and force a different perspective, it actually usually doesn't work. So chord progressions are the core, and those are the things that link together. Even though my music covers lots of genres, and I don't stick to particular, genre boundaries, it's the harmonic progressions that I love, and which, and I don't know why that is, but it just feels nice, and it feels. Or if I'm feeling shit, then I can express that as well, and then that's very cathartic. So that's the building block. I'll usually start with basic chord progression, some really basic digital synth. I'm just trying to get that chord progression down. Once I've got that, then I start to go to the hardware and sort of start to like build around that and improvise around those things. But sometimes I'll improvise the chord progression at the beginning as well, occasionally. With this piece of music with Rob Clouth, actually the whole thing was an improvisation, and we just, it's called A Moment Set Aside, and everything wasn't working, we were having a crap day, we were just failing to do everything we were trying to do, so let's just take time out and just go to the synth and not try and make a piece of music. And obviously that's when the piece of music happened, when we weren't trying to do it and we were just being free. Because a lot of the time that's a thing you can't, when you put too much pressure on yourself as well, it just doesn't work. And it's connected to that thing where I was saying earlier about, having failure as part of the process and not being too hard on ourselves and just trying to be honest and express things and not worry about it too much. A lot of my process, sorry, I'm rambling a long time here, but it's a good question. But a lot of my process has relied on a change in mindset from sitting and making and trying to construct, in inverted commas, the perfect piece of music, or trying to construct something that I thought that was good. My mindset's changed very much from that to just trying to express and not being too precious about it and just throwing stuff and just being like, this is how I feel. I'm just trying to get the feeling down as quickly as I can before I lose it. And worrying about whether it's good or not later and trying to separate out that critical analysis from the actual expression. And that's been a big change in the way I've worked, which I feel has helped, because otherwise it can be stifling, when you're trying to make music. Anyway, sorry, that was a very long answer, but thank you for the question. Is there any more?
There's one over here. Thank you ever so much. That I could ask you millions of questions. Firstly, I just wanted to comment on, I'm a neurodivergent artist, and from your work I get an amazingly sensorial, overwhelming experience, and I'd just like to thank you and wonder how much you are aware of kind of how your work functions in terms of artistic culture and in terms of like tapping onto in some, like there's so much within artistic culture within your work, and then that's like a whole conversation that I'd love to have with you. But then just thinking about how much you've talked about it coming from something really personal, I'd like to ask how you then go about the collaborative process and how that translates, or if there's ever any friction on whether working collaboratively hasn't worked for you, or how do you make sure that that is a relationship that your personal experience still is echoed through what is produced? I'm really sorry, that was very rambly and far too many questions.
No, I think I've got it. Thank you for the questions. I'm not aware particularly of how my work is perceived in different, cultures or neurodivergent realms or whatever it is that, I'm not particularly aware of that. Really, I just generally I'm somewhat unaware on purpose. I've made a real effort over the years to not look at anything anyone says about any of my music, because it's very personal to me, and I find vitriol online is not something that is conducive to me working. So in the end, we all know what it's like online, right? So I just think I've just tried to make an effort consciously to just do what I felt I wanted to, what I needed to do, and try to ignore any noise around that, which has meant I've become somewhat disconnected from the positive as well, which is a shame. And actually, that's why the project I did, the On Being project, was so meaningful for me. The one I played first, with all these beautiful things that people, quotes, this, what do you want to express that you feel you can't in everyday life? That project was so meaningful for me because I only really realized when I did that project, when I put out that question and I asked that the people that were listening to the music and engaging were having a lot of the same, all of these things people were writing about, I could empathize with, and I could put myself in their shoes and be like, I've thought that, I've felt that. Nearly all of it were these universal human experiences, and that was a really important project for me because it really gave me this intimate connection to people in that positive way, to realize that we do all share so much of what we experience. And previous to that point, I'd sort of just locked myself away and was just really not not interacting with people on that level. So, and then the second question, in terms of collaborations, how I collaborate with a visual artist. Yes, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes occasionally it just doesn't work at all. That's very rare. But in terms of how I try to make it work, the general technique is trying to understand what sort of person the artist is I'm working with, is. Like, what's their character type, what do they like, what don't they like, how do they like to work, and then really my job is beyond, having some sort of concept, maybe some musical snippet that they're interested in, some idea that we both are passionate about. Beyond that initial engagement, it's really like, how can I work with this person in a way to make their process enjoyable? And sometimes I go through in detail every scene by scene. We discuss things, and really detailed collaboration. Sometimes they really want to we set the parameters and we get some basic sketches that we both agree on, and they want to be free and not have me hassling them. And then everything in between. But really the technique, the key thing for me is, how can we both have fun? How can they have an enjoyable process? And how can they get emotionally engaged with the project in a way that, they become obsessed with it, and that really leads to the best results. And occasionally I work with people that it's a lot more procedural, and you can tell it's like it's a job for them and they're doing it for the money, and which is fine, and sometimes the work is still decent. But the best work always happens when we share a sort of excitement and can create this positive work experience together. So the challenge is how to get there, and it means very different things for very different people. So are there any more? A couple of questions at the front here. We'll come to you next.
Hi, thank you for sharing as well. That blew my mind, that hour there. I just wanted to ask, what would your advice be to emerging artists that want to start expressing themselves visually in their music, particularly electronic music? How would you go about that, especially with like minimal budget?
Yeah.
And how did you get into it also?
Yeah, I mean, I for my first release my first release on Traum, at least, which is this Cologne-based label, where I first started getting some traction with my music, then maybe in 2009, I think it was. From my first release in 2009 there, I was, really struggling to pay rent, and I didn't have a lot of money, but I had a tiny bit of money, and I paid someone to make a video with what I had, and And one of the things I still do now is, and one of the things that my collaborators has, mentioned that they like is, I'll just be really upfront and say, this is what I can afford, like this is what I'm interested in, this is the timeline, just be really upfront at the beginning. And a lot of people say no. Then some people be like, yeah, I'm into it, and if they're into the idea creatively and you get on, then a lot of the time they'll work to your budget. And the other thing I always do with visual artists I work with is we co-own the content. It's not like I don't just pay them and then just, I ask for permission to be able to play the content at shows, but often we'll get requests from museums to feature the projects, for example, and those come with fees, and then I always split with the visual artist the money that comes in. So there's this, again, I operate a sort of co-ownership model with them to try and, so that they can, as if things do well, that the money comes both ways. And there's things like that where it's just about trying to be really clear and upfront from the beginning. And my experience has been that people are often up for working on things for small budgets if they know that's all you've got, that's the resources you have available. And the earlier projects, the quality's not as good because they're not spending as much time, but that's fine. It's sort of, you can still express ideas. And actually, there's definitely some of the most impactful projects are not necessarily the ones that are really, I could play, let me just play this one. Like, there's one called Waves. It's a really simple project, one of the earliest projects I did with Kevin McLaughlin, who's this absolute brilliant artist from Sligo, and it was early on, I don't know how many years, 15 years ago or something. And it was part of that emergence project. I was looking for like what sort of aesthetics relating to the foundations of reality, and obviously waves are really important in quantum mechanics, and this sort of idea that beyond that waves give rise to everything ultimately. And Kevin built this such a simple system. It wasn't, but it's really stood the test of time because it simply and beautifully delivers an aesthetic. It's funnily actually the logo from this place is really, you can see it. But yeah, it's just it doesn't have to be something super high budget and super complex. Simple ideas delivered cleanly can be just as effective. So it's that. So again, that's another. It's like with when I had much smaller budgets, it's like, what can we do that does deliver the message in a simple and effective and cost-effective way? Yeah. So I don't know if that's. I guess that's a reasonable answer. Thanks.
Hi Max, before I ask my question, I just want to say that it was through your YouTube channel that I discovered the delights of Resolute Marina, and it's the reason why after this gig I'm actually going to VJ myself at a local event, and it's something I want to thank you for personally. In terms of my question, you talk a lot about collaborating with other people, but is artificial intelligence something that you use in your workflow, or if so, how? And if not, why?
Yeah. AI, I see AI as a powerful tool that can have a lot of good and bad. Do I use it a tiny bit? I think it's not really heavily used so far. I've done some visual projects. For example, I did a project with Xander Steenbruger where we had Wittgenstein quotes, and I was doing this project called Unspoken Words, and I was interested in what we can express that we can't put into words, and came to the Wittgenstein was this philosopher who had this ideas about language really limiting us, and a lot of the problems of philosophy being problems of language. So his writings are about the limitations of language, which link to this idea. So I went to his writings. I was like, I couldn't understand any of it. It's like absolute madness, right? So I was like, okay, I want to make an art project about this, but I just can't really spend the 6 months learning all his own terminology and structures. It's a massive task to really delve in and really understand his work. So I asked Sander, who was a sort of AI specialist. This was good 5, 6, 7 years ago. It was a while ago, and we had this early AI system where we could turn, prompt, you can turn text into visual. So it was like, let's just throw all this philosophical text in. And it was mad, it was brilliant. It created these amazing things, really bizarre. I can see if I can play it. Bizarre, beautiful visualizations from text that we couldn't have done otherwise. And for me, that was a great way of using AI because it was, and it wasn't specifically based on any artist's aesthetics or anything like that, but it was doing something that we couldn't do otherwise. And that was a nice use of it. But that was a good few years ago. I've turned away from it a bit more now in the visual realm. There's the occasional thing in there, but the one thing I have found recently, which has got me excited, there's an artist, a coder and creative in LA called Dylan Baston, and they have built, they build a lot of different compositional tools and really cool stuff for use in Ableton and other things, Max for Live. But they've got a recent tool called Chat DSP, where you can vibe code devices in real time, inside Ableton. So one of the things, I mentioned this project at the start where we had this digits of pi, and I wanted this sort of fractal nesting system for the melodies. There's lots of things like that where I'm like, oh, I wish I just had this plugin where I could, do this type of modulation, or I want to link this sort of data, to this type of parameter in Ableton. And it's things that if I was proficient at using Max for Live, Max for Live is like a coding language where you can sort of Ableton Live being the live and Max MSP being the language. It's sort of this it's like visual coding language. And if I was proficient at that, I could then code these things that I want and then experiment with these new techniques. But I'm not, and I've never had the time to, I used to code when I did research, but that was like 20 years ago in Perl. So it's nothing I can then transfer over to that world. So in the end, sometimes I can work with people to do that, but most of the time I just don't have the time and resource to be able to do it. But the doors that AI now opens is you can vibe code. You can just say, I want a device that does this, and then you can iteratively update it, and you can start to build these personalized tools for composition and for visuals and all sorts. So I think that's a realm where it's a really positive realm, I think. Maybe you could still argue there's negatives in there, but that's an exciting realm for me. But obviously then we've got there's a lot of problems with it as well in terms of all this work I've done. Presumably you could, in theory, you can just prompt and just say build it all, and it just does it all, and that's maybe putting us all out of jobs. But I do think there's a lot to be said for what comes from the creative process. It's like if I take one of these projects, I can't imagine a situation where I could have been at the beginning of the project and just prompted the outcome, because the outcome comes from the chat. We chat about ideas, we try something and it doesn't work, and we try something else, and then we accidentally hit the wrong thing, but it does something cool, and we like that, and we accidentally do something. There's this sort of hill climbing, lots of happy accidents, and you hear something on the radio and you go, oh, that's an interesting idea. And there's that humanized process of the creative process itself, which is how you get to the good thing. And I just feel like I couldn't have prompted that without having that process, or I couldn't have prompted to that as interesting an outcome. So I'm hopeful that there's still a place for humans in that, because of these ideas. And obviously the challenge for us as artists will be, what can we do that you can't prompt, or what can we do that AI can't do? And yes, it can do all these things, great, but it can't do this. And actually that could get super interesting, because it might push the arts into really new realms, really, and sort of force us to be novel and force us to not just have the box ticking pop music sort of, yes, this is what works, do it. It might force everything into actually interesting realms. So, it's hard to say how it's going to pan out, but I think there's a lot of potential positives and negatives. Any more questions? One at the front here. There's a mic still. Thanks. Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Was just going to ask if, as someone, if you know, if you're doing visual stuff, are there any particular websites or softwares that you'd recommend that are good for someone just want to start out and start to play around with these kind of systems?
Yeah. I mean, so the way my show works is very much rendered audio, rendered visual. Like if I put something up again, like, so it's like I'll have like lots of audio clips. When I trigger an audio clip, it will trigger a particular video clip, and then I'll have like if I like different cutoffs, so that as I'm filtering in a sound, it will do something different to the visual, which is musically and visually connected. So I'm basically jamming with pre-rendered clips of audio that I've made. You know, in the studio, I'll play the synths and all this. I'll compose the music, and then I'll get all these audio clips, drop them all in, and then I'll commission the visuals and get all these video clips, drop them all in, sync them up so that particular video clips are connected to particular audio clips, and then I've got this capacity to sort of like link drum sounds to different types of visual adjustments. So it allows me to have a system which is really flexible to like play anything at any time. There's no predefined structure. I can turn up at the show, you know, and everyone's seated down and we can have a nice ambient show, or I can arrive in Berlin and it's sweat dripping off the ceilings at 6 a.m. or whatever, and then I have to play really differently. And it's all set up to be able to do those two things. So that's using Ableton and Resolume, which are basically like DJ, live, VJ, live sort of hybrid tools. It's a sort of DJ, VJ, live hybrid system that I work with. I don't bring my synthesizers and play the keys. You know, I have tried that, and I can't handle, you know, I can't be designing the set list in real time as I'm doing a patch building, you know, on a synth. So I've really stripped it back to being like, what's most fun for me is to be able to really be free and not have any predefined structure, and really react to the audience and react to the acoustics and just find our way through together. That's the system I've sort of settled on after trying many different things. But yeah, Resolume is a great VJ tool, and it's really easy to use. It's really intuitive, and there's also, you know, visual synthesis tools in there as well, and all sorts. And then Ableton is a great system for making music as well as performing music. But beyond that, you know, Touch Designer, we use a lot of Touch Designer in the shows. For example, I can actually show you what it looks like. I do a lot of projects with Architecture Social Club, who are old friends I've worked with forever. Where is it? And we do like these 3-dimensional laser installation projects. That's more heavily based on Touch Designer, which is a much more powerful tool for real-time generative visual and music. If you really want to get into the coding and much more in-depth real-time generation, then I think Touch is, I mean, Max for Live, I mentioned earlier, you can do a lot, and that integrates with Ableton. You can do a lot in that as well, but Touch Designer is another monster of a system. But yeah, it just requires, I come from a DJing background, and I have a very emotional connection to what I do, and I'm not very patient with, I hate reading manuals, and I want to just try things and learn by doing, as opposed to, you know, learning the tech, like going to, you know, learning about how to do it. I just want to learn through doing, and that's served me well in a sense of developing techniques of my own, which particularly musically give me, give this sound, a particular sound. I mean, you could say the same thing. I was also asked about, you know, whether I'd been classically trained or anything like that, and whether I recommend learning music theory. And again, I haven't done any of that. My training is all, you know, background only in sciences, really, and I'm just emotionally engaged and just want to do things, and I'm willing to, I've spent, you know, 20 years making crap stuff to eventually make something all right. Or, you know, I've made so many hundreds and thousands of things that just because I love doing it, and through that process I've learned enough to sort of get by. So, but yeah, it depends. Again, it's all about personality types. You know, I've got good friends I work with who just love learning all the techniques and reading the manuals, and they love the technical side, really love it, and they become amazing at their craft through those approaches. And similarly, friends who've delved into music theory really seriously, and you know, her brilliant pianists or guitar players, and are able to then express things musically that blow my mind, and that, you know, I would love to be able to do. So there's no set way, but I guess it's all about what's fun for you and for us, and like how can you make it? Because I think the one thing everyone has to do is work. It's really time consuming and a lot of work, and it's like, how can you make your time enjoyable and rewarding, irrespective of whether anyone else ever hears it or ever enjoys it, or whether you ever make any money from it or whatever. You have to enjoy the process. So it's just finding, you know, doing what's fun. But yeah, Ableton and Resolume are great. Sorry, that was another right ramble, wasn't it? Any more questions, or is that about? Is there? Oh yeah, at the back there. I can't see a couple.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much. It was a brilliant talk. Did you have? Am I right in thinking you had a long-running residency in Leeds?
I've had, yeah, I was at Nottingham Uni.
In Nottingham.
Yeah, and I did play in Leeds. I was at Nottingham Uni from 99 to 2007 or 8. And during that time I had various residencies. We used to run a night in Nottingham called Firefly. Actually with Satyajit, who's the founder of this Architecture Social Club, who I was in first year with. We ran this night at the Bomb and the Marcus Garvey Ballroom in Nottingham. And then we used to travel all around, we used to travel all around the Midlands and the North to all the rave clubs and all. We were deep into that in the electronic music scene. So, and we had, did I have a residency here? I don't think I did. I remember I had a residency in one in Leicester, where fights broke out every weekend, and one in Birmingham in God's Kitchen, and then in Nottingham as well. I used to play like hip hop, and I used to do all the beat juggling and sort of breakbeat stuff with scratching. It was totally, I've been through many different realms musically, but yeah.
I was just wondering. You might have touched on it in the last answer, but how that shaped you creatively. Because you do make music for the dance floor.
Yeah, I mean, it's all in there. Like all my, 5 a.m. trance club, sweaty trance club roots, and drum and bass obsessions, and scratching and beat juggling and all this sort of. It's all in there in the music, and I think you can. I can hear it in there at least, and I just draw on as much as I can and try to. Put in as many of those references as I can, and it's very UK. There's also my work is extremely UK connected. I mean, I grew up near Belfast, but then when I arrived in the Midlands in Nottingham, I first started experiencing hip hop and breakbeat and drum and bass and all these things that didn't. Belfast was all sort of trance and hard house and techno, I suppose. And it's always been really interesting seeing how all of the history of the UK and all of the immigration patterns and the sort of different social groups have really influenced the different, different sounds in each city, and how each different, traveling around all these different cities in the north and the Midlands, and how their musical culture really connects to all of the, their social structures, and that's been a really interesting thing. And we're lucky in the UK to have such rich musical heritage in relation to the rich sort of waves of immigration and sort of social the social richness we have as well for different cultures in the country. So that's why so much UK music has been historically exported around the world, and why I'm also lucky enough to be able to do shows around the world for those same reasons. So yeah.
Hi. I just wondered how you obviously love your work. How do you, if you're juggling a number of projects at once, I just wondered how that kind of works. And also the fact that you're reacting live to the audience, but you're also so often behind screens. I just wondered what kind of thing. How is that feeling when you're behind the screens?
Yeah.
You're still seeing someone.
For the shows, yeah. I mean, I have these. Yeah, I mean, I can see people. They're semi-transparent screens, so like you've got that big screen at the front there. You can sort of see me hidden in there somewhere. But I can see the audience through the screen as well as the visual. So it helps me being able to see the visual because I can sort of see what's going on, and that's my monitor in a sense, that big semi-transparent screen. But I actually can see people through there as well, so I'm always trying to look out and listen as well to try and get reactions. So, sorry, but you asked another part of the question, which was which I've now totally forgotten. What was the first part of the question? Oh, the project juggling thing. Yeah. So that's something that came up yesterday as well when we had a chat about this stuff. I find it really hard to do more than one thing at once. And my general technique is to miss deadlines and wind people up whenever, if I'm really like emotionally engaged with something, I know that I just have to do it because that's when the good work happens. And the same thing about like I'll have to be waking up for some meeting or something at 9 o'clock, but it'll be like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and I'll be in the morning, and I'll be like, I'm just got to keep going, because if I'm excited and emotionally engaged, I have to just try and extract that because it's rare to when it really is working and you've got those moments. So I try to push everything aside in favor of things that are exciting, which then does cause problems, because then I'll sleep in and I'll miss the meeting, and that's not good. And then after, there's a lot of apologizing to people. But it's a difficult balancing act, because especially now, like as artists, we're expected to documenting and talking about work has almost become more important than the work itself in this sort of TikTok, Instagram, people follow personalities as much or maybe more so than actual creators of work. It's talking about things rather than making things. So that there's a lot of, it's really challenging basically to make that work. But for me, ultimately the fun, when I'm in that flow state, making something, that's why I do it. So I give that preference over other things, and then try and pick up the pieces and not annoy too many people along the way. But yeah, and I'm not good at multitasking, so it has to function like that. But again, some people I know that they're great at sort of spending 1 hour on a project and then 1 hour on another project, and they have it all laid out, and they can work like that really successfully. So again, it's just this personal, this personality type sort of situation again. Is that? Oh, there's one more question here. If we've got time. Yeah. On stage, it's really, really limited. I have like an APC-40, and I've got like an iPad with TouchOSC with a little like granular synth on there. So I have quite a minimal, and then I often have another controller if I'm doing like spatial audio as well, or extra, if there's lots and lots of screens, I have to have another controller for some extra things. But I really try and keep the live show side of things not using the studio hardware, because I wish I had a picture of the studio, but in the studio I have lots and lots of, I love all these retro synths that remind us of all these classic synth pop bands and all these that have so much character. And I try and bring in those synths, that I play those synths, and then I've got loads and loads of pedals, and it's this old analog. There's a lot of analog focus in my studio work, and then a lot of digital processing of that. But then when it comes to live shows, I just found when I toured with the analog gear, it was really hard work. It got broken. It doesn't turn up at the destination. The whole thing was super difficult, and also then I found it really hard to do the visuals as well as the music whenever I had the hardware. So I then just really stripped it back. But for shows, I'll have this, but I'll also have maybe another controller, and then I'll have CDJs, and I'll have a mixer as well, so I can do the EQing on a mixer, and I can add effects. I often do sort of delays and reverbs, and I add effects like that on a sort of DJ type mixer, and then I'll also have CDJs. So I'll have backup, and I'll have another visual system, laptop as well, which we can do, for extra outputs, but also as a backup machine in case one fails, I can swap between them. And I have the CDJs as well in case the audio machine fails, then I can play something. And occasionally what I'll do is, I don't know if anyone's, a lot of the time at the end of the show, I'll just play like The Prodigy or something, and just be like, let's have some fun with, we've done the serious thing. Let's have some fun, and I'll just play some random song off the CDJ, so that I give myself that flexibility to mix in as well. But really, it's a simple. In a lot of ways, it's a very stripped back DJ VJ live hybrid type of system, and I save the really complex stuff for studio time, studio work, so that when shows are stressful enough without all that stuff going wrong, particularly because I often do lots of projections, and that's usually the failure point, is like visual signal transmissions. So I'll often have to spend time on that, and I'm pleased that I don't have my synths as well. Any more? We got one more question at the front. Have we got time? I mean, I've got time, but so I'm aware we're going on for a while. But I'm happy to chat. But yeah.
I'm so sorry. I love your work.
Thank you.
Come from a very long way. So yes, this is very exciting. How do you think the audience and new upcoming artists have changed based on the new accessibility of technology and the overall acceptance of this type of installations as an art output?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always in awe of, upcoming artists, how technologically advanced. I often, Jake Olsen, who I work with, or Rob Clouth, Jessica In. There's these artists who, Odalie, but particularly, Rob Clouth, who he builds plugin, he writes the software which he makes the music on and performs with, and he writes the software which creates the visuals, and it's so dense and beautiful, and the people coming through who have grown up amongst technology, who have such a mastery of such a wider range than me. So I'm in awe of a lot of young artists that are coming through that just do amazing things. And I think also the vibe coding, the AI side of things is going to open up so many more doors as well for people to express themselves through technology in amazing new ways. So it's exciting to see what people do and to be around that. And what ways it changed arts in general. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because where we are now in the Glasshouse in Gateshead, I never would have been here 10 years ago as an artist putting on a show, playing drum and bass or techno in a classical concert hall. It just wasn't done. And now, the whole show's not going to be techno, so I'm not gonna. I'll hopefully get invited back, and if I play the whole show techno, I probably wouldn't get invited back. But there is a acceptance that these genres are part of arts in a wider sense that has come in recent years, I suppose. So it's really, and I've really enjoyed being, getting access and being invited to play in venues that were traditionally for, I play a lot of, I mentioned Salzburg Festival. It's really a, opera and classical music but they're bringing in electronic things, and it's just happening across the board. And I guess it's just, we're all like aging ravers who still like electronic music and are happy to sit down and listen to it in that sort of environment. And it's been pushed into the realms of music more widely rather than having to be only for clubs. And I think that's great. And it also opened a lot of doors for me when I started playing those sort of venues, because I was like, oh great, I don't have to make people dance the whole time. Now I can play 20 minutes, or I can play ambient music and people aren't going to be throwing bottles at me. And that's great, because then you can do things artistically, because it opens a lot of doors. And that's why, that's the whole reason I stopped just working with techno labels and just stopped making, because I was feeling creatively hemmed in, because I loved all these other things. And that's also why I started a label, Mesh. We started this label The idea of mesh being, this intersection between music and arts and sciences. So it's about music that's part of these wider visual projects or science-related projects, and it's music, electronic music, and well, not just electronic, acoustic as well, music that's part of these wider arts projects. And that's why we started that label. Myself and James Bullock, who sadly passed away a year ago or so. But yeah, it's nice to see, and I think there's a lot of exciting potential and a lot we can do with these beautiful, concert spaces that are so well equipped and beautifully acoustically, and you can actually, there's so much more potential for delivering, really meaningful electronic music experiences in those venues. So it's exciting to be part of that for sure. Is that are we done now? I think, yeah. Thank you very much for all the good questions. It was a pleasure.